On a freezing dawn in 1951, in the middle of the Korean Sea, the Canadian destroyer HMCS Cayuga was cutting through the dark waves like a steel blade lost in the void. The wind howled through the metal corridors, making the ceiling lights sway while an alarm echoed through the ship. More wounded on board. In the cramped little office that served as the infirmary, a man in a white coat wiped the sweat from his hands onto his uniform pants. The nurses crowded around him, waiting for orders. On the improvised stretcher, a Korean soldier was gasping for air, his chest torn open by shrapnel, blood running down his side. He needed chest surgery, right there, right now, in the middle of the ocean. "Dr. Sear, you're the only one who can save him," a sailor said, eyes wide with panic. The doctor took a deep breath, feeling the mixed smell of iodine, metal, and fear. He looked at the small table beside him, where a thick surgery manual lay open on a hastily marked page. Minutes earlier, alone in his quarters, he had skimmed through those instructions like someone trying to memorize a magic trick right before going on stage. His hands were shaking, not from lack of courage, but for a reason no one on that ship could possibly imagine. He picked up the scalpel. The room seemed to hold its breath along with the patient. Every gaze in that compartment carried the same certainty. That man was a brilliant surgeon, a hero in wartime. Only he knew the truth. Because that night, in the middle of the Korean War, the man about to open a human chest and try to stitch life back together had never been to medical school. His name wasn't Dr. Joseph Sear. His name was Ferdinand Waldo Demara. And this is the story of how the greatest imposter of the 20th century became a doctor, a monk, and a captain, without ever officially being any of them. Some made fortunes in seconds, others lied for years. Some fooled kings, others fooled the entire world. This isn't a channel about ordinary crimes. It's about brilliant lies, dirty moves, and dangerously clever minds. Real scams, legendary con men, and the dark side of money. Welcome to Dirty Game. The lights of the old neighborhood movie theater didn't come on anymore. The marquee, once glowing with posters of Hollywood stars, now showed broken letters hanging crooked over the cold sidewalk. A boy stares at the locked iron door, his hands buried in the pockets of a hand-me-down coat, way too big for his small body. He knows that building, now silent and dark, used to be a symbol of prestige for his family. Now it's just a reminder of everything they lost. Years earlier, the story was very different. Lawrence, Massachusetts was breathing optimism. The neighborhood theaters were more than entertainment. They were status symbols. Ferdinand Waldo Demara's father worked as a projectionist, but no one saw him as just an employee. There was a certain pride in being behind the magic, controlling the light that turned a blank wall into imaginary worlds. The family had comfort, decent clothes, plenty of food, and more than anything, a sense of belonging to a rising middle class. Fred's uncle owned movie theaters. For a kid, that meant special access. Empty hallways before showtimes, packed rooms afterward, huge posters arriving in rolls, the faint smell of burning film in the projector. Fred grew up watching his father being treated with respect, hearing stories about businessmen, theater owners, important people who moved in that world. At home, the message was clear. They weren't rich, but they were above the anonymous crowd. There was an almost aristocratic pride in the way the family talked about itself. That pride slipped into everyday conversations. Comments about who knew how to behave, who had good manners, about people of class versus people with no class. The silent message hit hard. More than money, what really mattered was the image. The way you dressed, the way you talked, the way you were seen. Fred absorbed all of this as naturally as a kid who doesn't fully understand the world yet, but already feels its hierarchies. Then the Great Depression hit like a hard cut to black in the middle of a movie. First came the small signs, fewer people at the afternoon shows, owners complaining about ticket sales, late payments to suppliers. Then came the layoffs, the debts, the fear. What was an economic crisis for many became a personal collapse for Fred's father. The uncle's theaters suffered, profits vanished, and the family's prestige disappeared at the same speed as the red numbers on the books. The bankruptcy wasn't just financial, it was emotional. The father who used to come home with a confident look now walked in with a heavy face and distant eyes. Conversations at the dinner table got shorter, sharper. Suddenly, the family had to cut back on everything. Less meat, patched up clothes, overdue bills. The house that once felt like a symbol of stability now seemed too big for what they could actually afford. Moving to a poorer neighborhood wasn't just changing addresses, it was a public downgrade. The truck carrying their furniture, the neighbors peeking through their windows, the contrast between what was and what now was. Fred felt it in his body. The more worn-out floors, the damper walls, the louder, rougher surroundings. The streets no longer carried that same air of safety and promise. He noticed the way his mother cleaned and arranged the house with almost desperate effort, trying to squeeze some dignity out of what was left. At school, the fall in status became even more obvious. Classmates who once saw him as the son of a respectable family now kept their distance. Subtle comments about a tough phase, jokes about going broke, looks that mixed pity and superiority. Kids are quick to spot social weakness. Fred learned in the harshest way that the world doesn't forgive anyone who slips down a rung. That's when something lit up inside him. He started watching not just what people had, but how they presented themselves. He noticed that some fathers, even just as broke, still carried themselves with an air of respectability thanks to a good suit, a confident tone of voice, a firm handshake. He noticed that certain men with perfect teeth and sharp suits were still treated with deference, even while drowning in debt just like his father. It wasn't the real situation that dictated how they were treated. It was the story they managed to tell about themselves. That realization, still blurry, slowly started to take shape in the boy's mind. He understood that material truth, money, assets, paid bills, was only part of the game. There was another layer, slipperier and more powerful. The narrative. Who you say you are. What other people believe you are. While his father sank into the shame of bankruptcy, pulling away, avoiding contact, almost disappearing socially, Fred began walking the opposite path. Instead of shrinking, he tried to look like more than he really was. He adjusted his behavior, copied the mannerisms of successful people he still saw around town. He polished stories, left out certain details, dressed up others. Little by little, he discovered that small distortions could help rebalance the scale of humiliation. If someone asked about the family situation, he learned to answer with phrases that sounded true but weren't entirely. It was just a rough patch. We're reorganizing things. My dad is working on new business deals. Not full-on lies, but not truths either. They were versions. Early tests of something that would later become a whole way of life. The movie theater, now shut down, worked as a permanent symbol of that lesson. Before, all it took was turning off the hall lights, firing up the projector, and within seconds an alternate reality took over the screen. Worlds appeared out of nowhere. Characters stepped out of the dark. Stories came to life in front of a hypnotized audience. Fred, who had grown up behind the scenes of that illusion, began to see the mechanism in a deeper way. In his mind, the gap between that glowing screen and real life started to shrink. If a whole room could cry over suffering that wasn't real, if it could cheer for heroes that never existed, why would the world outside the theater be so different? If people were moved and convinced by what they were shown, maybe the secret wasn't in the truth of the facts, but in the consistency of the performance. The boy who watched his last name slide from a position of respect into the discomfort of social embarrassment learned a quiet lesson. In a world that judges by appearances, surviving isn't just about having. It's about seeming to have. It's not enough to be someone, you have to play someone. For many people, a social fall is the end. For Ferdinand Waldo Demara, it was the lab. It was on that rougher ground, surrounded by the leftovers of lost prestige, that the first seeds of the future imposter were planted. A boy who learned far too early that reality can be a hostile place, but a well-built story can open doors that the truth alone would never touch. The bell cuts through the early hours of the morning like a blade. It's still dark when the monks rise in silence, quick steps echoing through the cold corridors of the Trappist monastery in Rhode Island. Among them, a novice younger than he's supposed to be there struggles to keep up. On paper, he's 18. In reality, Ferdinand Waldo Demara is 16. He didn't end up there out of vocation, but out of escape. Days earlier, the Demara household in Lawrence was suffocating with tension. Poverty, bill collectors, neighbors talking, a father broken by the depression. To Fred, the house felt like a cage, furniture that reminded them of a better past, unpaid bills that didn't add up, heavy silences at the table. Going to a monastery wasn't a leap of faith, it was a way out. A place where no one would ask about money, only about obedience. The lie about his age is small, but decisive. One single number changed was enough to open the gate. To the monks, he was just another novice searching for God. To him, it was a hiding place, a chance to leave behind the family humiliation and try on a new role, the young religious man. Trappist life is rigid. Waking up before dawn for vigil, hours of prayer, manual labor, almost absolute silence. Time is ruled by the bell, not by desire. For Fred, it's a shock. The silence doesn't calm him, it exposes him. Every minute without talking is filled with thoughts that spin way too fast for that narrow kind of life. He watches everything closely. He notices how authority shows up there. Who walks in front, who sits where, who has the right to speak. He understands that in that world, power isn't in money, but in the appearance of purity, invisible obedience. The one who looks more devout is the one people listen to with more respect. Fred tries to shape himself to fit. He learns the Latin prayers, imitates the tone of the chants, lowers his eyes at the right moments. He's disciplined enough not to attract attention for the wrong reasons, but something in him stays out of sync. He doesn't just want to obey, he wants to influence. He doesn't just want to follow rules, he wants to understand who writes them and how they can be bent. The superiors start to notice. There's intelligence, but also impatience. 2 years of this quiet friction lead to a dry verdict. He's considered unsuitable for monastic life. There's no scandal, just a conclusion. He lacks the stability the Trappist ideal demands. Instead of sending him straight back into secular life, the church tries to redirect him. Fred is sent to the Brothers of Charity in Canada. The setting changes. Less strict enclosure, more contact with the outside world, a focus on service and education. It's still the church, still discipline, but with a different kind of routine. In West Newbury, he even teaches boys. The classroom becomes a new kind of stage. Rows of desks, eyes turned toward him, the expectation for answers. All of that feeds a side of him that the monastery had tried to smother. He discovers that he likes explaining things, improvising, speaking confidently about almost anything. A firm tone of voice and an authoritative posture earn instant respect. Teaching for him isn't just about passing on content, it's performance. He realizes that with the right delivery, he can step into the role of the one who knows, even if he's only one step ahead of his students. It's a testing ground for what will later become his method. Walk into complex environments, learn just enough to look like an expert, and hold that role in front of others. But living with the brothers and their superiors repeats the same pattern. The rigid hierarchy gets under his skin. Orders that cannot be questioned. Decisions made, because that's how it's always been. Public corrections. All of it hits a pride that, since childhood, refuses to accept being lesser. He can't stand the idea of remaining forever at the bottom of the ladder. The conflict doesn't blow up in a dramatic scene. It piles up in small clashes. A sharp remark, a reprimand for lack of discipline, suspicion about his true motivation. Little by little, it becomes clear that he doesn't want to be just another obedient religious brother. He wants to be the main character. And religious institutions, no matter how much they try to contain him, are not built for someone whose instinct is constant reinvention. The decision to leave grows quietly. When he breaks with that path, he's not just abandoning a possible religious life, he's ending an identity experiment. He wore the habit, learned the codes, played the part, and now he walks away to try another. In 1941, the world is at war, and the United States Army offers a new structure, a new uniform, another kind of promise. For many young men, enlisting is a patriotic duty. For Ferdinand Demara, it's one more door, an environment where authority has different forms, and the chances of hiding inside a huge institution are even greater. The teenager who ran to God looking for shelter from poverty and shame leaves the religious world with two silent convictions. It's possible to enter closed systems if you show up with the right story. And once you're inside, the role you play can be just as important as who you really are. The farewell letter lies folded on the narrow mattress. In the simple room on the naval base, an open window lets in the cold night wind. The note talks about exhaustion, failure, a man who can no longer handle the pressure. Everything sounds believable, dramatic in just the right measure. Not far away, at the edge of a dark pier, there are footprints, a shoe, some sign of a desperate jump. For the Navy, it will look like a tragedy. For Ferdinand Demara, it's just another carefully staged scene. Before this staged death, there had been another break. Fred had joined the Army like so many other young men in 1941, surrounded by patriotic speeches, crisp uniforms, and waving flags. But behind the aesthetics of discipline, there was something that bothered him deeply. The military hierarchy was rigid, impersonal, and impermeable to improvisation. There, moving up didn't depend on charisma or storytelling. It depended on time, obedience, and often on credentials he didn't have. Short orders, superiors who didn't have to justify anything, repetitive tasks. Fred, who had already tasted the thrill of reinventing himself in religious environments, felt boxed in. He didn't want to be just another anonymous soldier in a seemingly endless line of men. What felt like security to many felt like a prison to him. Desertion doesn't happen overnight. It takes shape inside him. The idea of simply disappearing from those rigid ranks becomes irresistible. When he decides to run, he's not just leaving a post, he's abandoning an identity. He leaves behind the official Demara and steps into a new name, Anthony Ignolia. With that name, he knocks on the doors of another Trappist monastery, this time in Gethsemane, Kentucky. The pattern repeats itself, a religious institution as refuge, the habit as a mask. To the monks, he's a young man searching for God. To him, he's a fugitive, hiding behind a fresh record. The silence, the prayers, the manual labor, none of it is vocation anymore, it's cover. When things start to tighten and the risk of being discovered grows, he doesn't hesitate to repeat the move. He leaves Gethsemane and heads to another monastery, New Melleray in Iowa. The scenery changes, fields, cloisters, austere dining halls. But the logic stays the same. Each new place is a chance to cover his tracks, rewrite his past, and test how far he can go with a name that isn't his. But the world outside those monastic walls hasn't gone anywhere. The army, the desertion, the official records, all of that still exists, ready to catch up to him. At some point, those spiritual walls stop feeling safe. The past threatens to arrive through cross-checked information, letters, rumors. Fred realizes he can't stay there forever. That's when his father reappears as a figure of confrontation, a tired man, worn down by bankruptcy and shame, still trying to salvage what little order he can see in life. He insists that his son should turn himself in, clear things up, face the consequences. For the father, honor lies in answering for what you've done. For the son, honor is a useless word in a system that would reduce him to a serial number and a permanent stain on his file. The conversation doesn't solve anything. The father appeals to morality, duty, the idea of doing the right thing. Fred doesn't see any of that as an answer, only as an invitation to lose his freedom. Once again, he chooses escape. But this time, he doesn't hide in monasteries. He looks for another type of institution, the United States Navy. He joins as a hospital corpsman. The environment changes. Now it's infirmary corridors, stretchers, surgical instruments, doctors and nurses in constant motion. It's a new universe, more technical, more complex. And for someone with a sharp memory and a gift for learning fast, it's a gold mine. Fred watches procedures, picks up terms, memorizes routines. Every institutional space for him is a potential stage. But the hierarchy starts to bother him again. He expects promotions, recognition. He imagines his intelligence and dedication will be noticed and rewarded. When that doesn't happen, the frustration builds. In the military mindset, effort doesn't guarantee advancement. There are fixed rules, timelines, priorities. For someone who lives by forcing shortcuts, that's almost an insult. Out of that frustration comes an extreme idea. If the system won't open a door for him, he'll create his own exit. He fakes his own suicide. The letter, the scene at the pier, the suggestion of a body lost in the water. Everything is calculated so the Navy will consider him dead. A death duly recorded, closing an administrative file and clearing the way for his next role. For that next role to exist, he needs more than just a disappearance. He needs a new name with built-in credentials. That's when Robert Linton French enters the picture. When Fred gains access to his documents, he finds exactly what he's been looking for. A profile that combines intellectual authority with religious legitimacy. French is a psychologist tied to religious institutions. The perfect combination for the kind of respectable figure Demara wants to become. He steals the identity and reinvents himself as a religious psychologist. It's not just a new name, it's a ready-made biography. Degrees, experience, credentials. Everything that opens doors in schools, seminaries, and Catholic institutions, eager for someone with academic training and spiritual polish. Fred understands that with the right paperwork and a confident speech, people rarely dig deeper. The appearance of competence is accepted as proof of competence. At this point, a principle starts to solidify in the mind of the budding imposter. The burden of proof is always on the accuser. As long as no one suspects anything, as long as no one asks direct questions, as long as no one is brave enough to challenge what's written on official documents, he's safe. The paperwork becomes a shield. The confident tone, his armor. His calm under questioning, his best weapon. The army deserter, the monk with borrowed names, the hospital corpsman who died only to be reborn as a doctor. All these stages are shaping an inner logic. To Demara, the world is a chessboard of institutions that trust far too much in letterheads and outward signs of authority, and he's determined to exploit every gap in that system. The auditorium is packed, but the silence is absolute. On stage, a man in a black cassock and discreet glasses talks about child psychology as if he'd spent years in clinics and universities. He quotes authors, describes family dynamics, explains complexes in simple, confident language. Parents in the audience nod along. Catholic school principals watch him with approval. To everyone there, he is Dr. Robert Linton French, an expert in education and behavior. To Ferdinand Demara, this is just the role of the moment, and so far his most successful one. Before that scene, there was a carefully planned pilgrimage. With French's documents in hand, Demara knocks on the doors of Catholic institutions like someone presenting a ready-made solution. The resume is spotless: solid education, religious background, a clear calling for teaching. In a world where academic titles are still rare, especially when combined with a religious habit, he shows up as the perfect answer. Gannon College in Pennsylvania opens its doors to him. On campus, Dr. French is not just another professor. He rules the classroom with a mix of charm and intellectual boldness. He teaches psychology as if the human mind were a territory he knows by heart. His exceptional memory lets him quote passages from books he skimmed or barely flipped through. He connects concepts, improvises examples, answers hard questions without blinking. Sometimes the content is intuitive or pieced together from fragmented readings, but his tone is always that of unquestionable authority. The religious community sees something rare in him, a man who moves easily between the language of faith and the language of science. It doesn't take long for him to be promoted. He gains visibility, prestige, and influence over decisions. He ends up appointed Dean of Philosophy, a position that beyond status lets him shape curricula, reports, and course directions. The boy who once ran away from rigid military hierarchies now calmly runs a small academic structure with a soft voice and a technical vocabulary. During this phase, Demara writes a small guide on parenting. The text is simple and practical, and it starts circulating as a resource for Catholic parents. The booklet cements his image. Here is a specialist concerned with values, discipline, and emotional development. The name Dr. French now carries weight beyond the college campus. But the same trait that lifts him up, the feeling that he can do anything, is what drags him down. The pattern repeats itself. Once he notices cracks in the system, he pushes his luck. Fake checks appear as a natural extension of someone used to living off well-built fictions. If identity documents can be recreated, why not numbers on paper? His downfall is less spectacular than his rise. There's no dramatic chase, just uncomfortable discoveries, bank accounts that don't add up, and trust that starts to crumble. The Dr. French persona doesn't fall apart because of what he says in class, but because of what he does at the bank. When the facade finally breaks, Demara walks away from that world like he has from so many others. Without looking back, he passes through other monasteries, Benedictines, Brothers Hospitallers of St. John of God, as if testing new frames for the same face. The cassock, the silence, the religious routine once again serve as a shelter between one identity and the next. But by now, it's clear that the cloister isn't enough. His urge to hold positions of authority, to move through more complex environments, speaks louder. In Los Angeles, he works as an assistant in a sanatorium. Now, the setting is different. The corridors of a psychiatric institution, the smells of medication, the confused voices of patients. Demara watches doctors, nurses, and routines. Once again, he learns the local language, clinical terms, technical expressions, power dynamics. The world of mental health is added to his growing list of fields he knows only on the surface, but talks about as if he owned them. Later, he crosses the map to the state of Washington, where he works as a teacher at St. Martin's College. The audience changes, the accent changes, but the core pattern stays the same. He always shows up exactly where institutions need someone with titles and a confident way of speaking, and he fills that gap with almost unsettling ease. This time, though, the past doesn't stay so far away. The FBI steps in. They're not just looking for a professor, they're looking for the deserter. More than the bad checks, more than the fake resumes. What really counts is his break with the armed forces. The Navy that had declared him dead hasn't forgotten. Institutions talk to each other, records are cross-checked, and the name Demara resurfaces where only Dr. French or other aliases should exist. The arrest is far less glamorous than any role he's ever played. Military discipline returns, now in its harshest form. 18 months in the Naval Disciplinary Barracks in San Pedro, California, for desertion. Bars, strict routine, no room for improvisation. For the first time in a long while, he's not directing the story. He's stuck inside one written by others, but when he gets out, he doesn't emerge humbled or transformed. He comes out more observant. Inside, he's watched how bureaucratic systems really work with even more clarity. He's seen how files, reports, signatures, and stamps shape people's lives. He's understood that if papers can lock you up, they can also set you free, depending on who controls them. He takes on a new identity and decides to expand his intellectual arsenal. He studies law at night at Northeastern. It's not just about getting a degree, it's about learning the formal language that structures contracts, responsibilities, and power. Law gives him a map of the institutional maze he's been instinctively navigating for years. At the same time, he joins the Brothers of Christian Instruction in Maine. The combination is explosive: experience in education, religious credibility, knowledge of psychology and law, and a strong sense of organization. In that context, he reaches his peak in institutional power. Almost single-handedly, he mobilizes efforts, contacts, and resources to found a new college, Lamennais College. Once again, Ferdinand Demara steps into a vacuum. Where there was a need for someone with initiative, vision, and a confident voice, he takes the lead. He presents plans, persuades superiors, structures courses, recruits students. The college becomes a reality, and with it comes a rush of creative power. He's not just filling a position, he's helping build an institution from the ground up. In any ordinary story, this would be the turning point. The redemption arc where the imposter finally finds a legitimate place to use his talents. But Demara's life rarely follows the expected route. When it's time to choose who will be the president, the top position, the symbolic crown on all his work, his name doesn't make the cut. The decision hits a nerve. His pride. It wasn't enough to work, think, and organize. The religious structure still follows its own internal logic. Hierarchy, seniority, the order's interests. He, who helped bring the college into existence, watches the top spot slip away. The break is inevitable. Demara refuses to stay as a supporting character in a story he helped write. He cuts ties with the order, walks away from yet another institution, and leaves behind the college he helped found. The pattern is now clearer than ever. He enters, rises quickly, occupies space, tests the limits, and when he hits a ceiling he can't break through, he burns the bridge and goes searching for the next institution to reinvent. The smell of fresh blood mixed with oil, metal, and sea air. The destroyer HMCS Cayuga rocked on the waves of the Pacific, while sailors ran through its narrow corridors, rushing stretchers back and forth. Screams in Korean and English overlapped. Orders were shouted, boots pounded on the deck like a desperate march. In the middle of that chaos, a man wearing a makeshift surgical gown was fighting something more dangerous than the war outside, his own inability. On paper, he was Dr. Joseph Cyr, a Canadian surgeon. In reality, he was Ferdinand Demara, with no medical degree, no residency, no real hands-on experience in surgery. And yet everyone around him looked at him as the only hope for those wounded men. Minutes earlier, when the first Korean soldier was brought into the infirmary with his chest torn open by shrapnel, Demara felt a cold, cutting fear in his stomach. He knew with brutal clarity that he had crossed a line. Pretending to be a professor, a psychologist, a dean, that was one thing. Pretending to be a surgeon in the middle of a war, with lives bleeding out in front of him, was a whole different level of imposture. Even so, he didn't back down. He ran to his cabin, locked the door, and pulled out what, for him, was the most powerful weapon he had: a surgery manual. The pages, filled with diagrams, technical terms, and step-by-step instructions, became his lifeline. With a pencil in hand, he underlined sections, memorized procedures, and repeated the key steps out loud. All of this in a matter of minutes. Outside, the shouting only grew louder. The path that led him there had started far from the sea, in Maine. That's where Demara met the real Joseph Cyr, a young Canadian surgeon, respected and with a bright future ahead of him. There was something about the doctor's figure that fascinated him. The white coat, the way others listened to him, the almost sacred status of a man who saves lives. For someone obsessed with symbolic authority, nothing seemed more powerful than that mix of science and heroism. The idea came to him like so many others in his life, simple, bold, and seemingly obvious. If a surgeon like Cyr had prestige and access, why couldn't he take that place himself? Documents could be copied, signatures could be forged, personal stories could be tweaked. What mattered wasn't the real past, but the consistency of the performance in the present. Demara studied just enough to talk like a doctor. He learned jargon, memorized anatomical terms, picked up the language of clinical reports. With the right papers in hand and a confident way of speaking, the leap was almost natural. In 1951, he joined the Royal Canadian Navy as Dr. Joseph Cyr. The Korean War turned the ocean into a constant route for the wounded. On the destroyer Cayuga, the ship's doctor wasn't just a healthcare professional. He was a thin line between life and death. His colleagues treated him with instant respect. Officers greeted him with deference. Nurses followed his orders without question. The uniform, the documents, and his steady posture did the rest, until reality demanded more than words. In the ship's infirmary, broken bodies kept arriving. The first patient, a Korean soldier, was barely breathing, his chest soaked in blood. The whole team turned to Demara. There was no time to call for help from another ship, no hospital nearby. Either he operated, or the man would die right there. When he came back from his cabin with the manual almost burned into his memory, something in his expression had changed. The fear was still there, but now buried under a layer of almost icy determination. He called for specific instruments, adjusted the patient's position, directed the assistants. He followed the steps like someone walking a map he had just memorized, but with the steadiness of someone who'd been doing it for years. Inside that improvised operating room, the air felt heavy. Every cut, every stitch, every movement of the surgeon's hand was watched in tense silence. Demara knew he had no room for hesitation. If he showed doubt, everything would collapse. So he did what he'd always done best. He performed absolute confidence. The improbable happened. The patient survived. Others followed. Wounded men with bullets lodged deep, shrapnel near the heart, internal bleeding. Demara alternated between the manual, devoured over and over in the short breaks, and the operating table. He improvised techniques, adapted procedures, relied on his memory and on the help of experienced nurses. The line between real knowledge and imitation grew thinner and thinner. In the end, all the men he operated on lived to tell the tale. To the crew, there was no doubt. This doctor was exceptional. News of the heroic surgeon spread. When the Cayuga returned to shore, Canadian newspapers eagerly reported the story. The name Dr. Joseph Cyr was celebrated as a symbol of courage and skill in wartime. Demara's picture in a medical officer's uniform appeared next to glowing headlines, but the war, contrary to what he might have thought, wasn't the most dangerous setting. The real danger was far from the front lines, in an ordinary house in Canada, where a woman was reading the newspaper with growing concern. The real Dr. Cyr's mother, seeing her son's name in battle reports he had never mentioned, became suspicious. The dates, locations, assignments, nothing matched the actual life of the surgeon she knew. Doubt turned into outrage. Outrage turned into a formal complaint. The Canadian Navy received the warning and opened a quiet investigation. In a military environment, suspicion is like a crack in a ship's hull, small but dangerous. They cross-checked records, compared signatures, matched data. Slowly, the heroic figure began to unravel into something much more uncomfortable. An imposter at the center of an official war story. When confronted, Demara didn't hold out for long. Maybe out of calculation, maybe out of sheer exhaustion, he ended up confessing. The revelation wasn't just some bureaucratic fraud. It was a direct hit to the institution's credibility. Admitting publicly that they had put a fake surgeon on a warship would have been an international scandal. The Canadian Navy chose silence. Instead of a big public trial, they went for a quiet exit. Demara was dismissed from service, erased from the structure, removed like a typo from an official report. No scandalous headlines, no highly publicized military court. The same institution that, days earlier, had proudly showcased its saintly surgeon, now just wanted to get rid of him with as little noise as possible. Deported back to the United States, Ferdinand Demara left behind more than a uniform. He left a chapter in which his imposture reached an almost unbelievable level, saving lives in a war he had never been properly trained to fight in. The Cayuga episode crystallized something that had been forming since his childhood. In a world obsessed with titles, appearances, and story, he had discovered just how far it was possible to go with a borrowed name, a manual in hand, and a calmness that stood right on the edge of the abyss. The black and white photo showed him with a serious expression, eyes slightly turned toward the camera, uniform immaculate. In the caption, a title that would stick to him forever, The Great Imposter. In 1952, Life magazine didn't just tell the story of Ferdinand Waldo Demara. It turned him into a national character. Back in the United States, after the HMCS Cayuga episode, Demara realized there was something as valuable as any position he'd ever gained with fake documents: his own story. Journalists came after him, curious about the man who had been a monk, professor, and war surgeon without ever going to medical school. He instinctively understood what that meant. If the world wanted a legendary imposter, he could sell that legend. The deal with life wasn't just an interview, it was a pact with fame. The article described him with a mix of shock and fascination: extraordinary memory, unusual boldness, the ability to enter any institution and become indispensable in a short time. For post-war America, used to more traditional hero stories, Demara was a disorienting figure. A man who, without weapons, money, or a real degree, had outplayed armies, universities, and governments armed only with paper, ink, and nerves of steel. The country started seeing him as a national curiosity. People laughed, admired, and were scandalized. When he told his side of the story, he chose his angles carefully. He highlighted the successes, downplayed the damage, and turned dangerous episodes into witty anecdotes. Each new professional reinvention sounded like an almost comical adventure. The imposter started feeding on his own mythology. But fame is a double-edged sword. On one hand, his story brought him fees, invitations, attention, and even a certain sympathy from the public. On the other hand, it made every new disguise more fragile. With his face now known across the country, walking into any institution required more caution. Anyone might recognize the man who had once posed as a surgeon, professor, monk, or psychologist. Even so, Demara didn't abandon the urge to infiltrate new systems. The addiction wasn't just surviving, it was playing roles. In Huntsville, Texas, he took jobs inside a system he already knew from the outside: prisons. First as an employee, later even as an assistant warden in a penitentiary. The irony was brutal. The man who had so often dodged the law was now helping to enforce it. With his usual mix of apparent discipline and smooth talk, he earned the trust of his superiors. He understood hierarchy, bureaucracy, control. He'd lived long enough inside rigid institutions to know exactly how to move within them. Inside the prison, many co-workers saw him as an efficient staff member. But among the inmates, the gaze was different. Suspicious, sharp, trained to pick up inconsistencies. It was in one of those cells that his past came back to him in printed form. An inmate was flipping through an old edition of Life, articles, photos, ads, until one image froze his attention. The face on the page and the face walking the prison corridors were the same. The caption talked about the great imposter. For a prisoner used to dealing with stories, masks, and fake fronts, the connection was instant. Demara, the respectable assistant warden, was also the man from the magazine. The revelation spread quietly through the cell blocks. Suppressed laughter, whispered comments, mocking looks. It didn't take long for the administration to find out. Another identity fell apart. This time surrounded by the bitter irony of being unmasked in a place where most people weren't allowed any kind of mask at all. The pattern repeated itself. Exposure, discomfort, trouble with the law. But by then, fatigue was starting to creep into the cracks of his self-confidence. In the following years, new names appeared. In 1956, he resurfaced as Martin Godgart, a teacher on North Haven Island in Maine. The island, isolated, seemed like the perfect place for a fresh start. Small communities, schools needing teachers, and few resources for deep background checks. There, he taught English and Latin, charmed students with engaging explanations, and quoted classic authors with the ease of someone who supposedly lived among books all his life. The community trusted him. Parents saw him as a respectable figure. Colleagues treated him as a solid intellectual. In a small town, the word of a cultured teacher carried weight. Demara experienced once again a smaller-scale version of the power he'd had at larger colleges, but with the same dose of local prestige and control. At the same time, something in him was starting to fall apart. The strain of keeping up so many identities, the constant fear of being discovered, the pressure of sustaining a level of competence that was often built on the edge of disaster. All of that came with a price. Drinking quietly became part of the routine, an anesthetic for the permanent nervousness, for the growing feeling that he was living in a castle made of fragile paperwork. The great imposter was approaching his physical and psychological limits. In 1959, his story took on a new form and a new scale. Writer Robert Crichton released the book, The Great Imposter, which quickly became a bestseller. The book raised Demara's image to another level. He was no longer just a magazine oddity, but a full-blown literary character. Now the public could follow, chapter by chapter, the path of a man who had worn so many uniforms without truly owning any of them. The success of the book opened the doors to another stage: television. Popular shows invited him for interviews and special appearances. On You Bet Your Life, hosted by Groucho Marx, Demara appeared as a good-humored guest, answering questions, cracking jokes, and telling his adventures with an almost shy smile. The contrast between the seriousness of his actions and the light tone in which he told them only deepened the public's fascination. He turned frauds into behind-the-scenes stories, impostures into near comedies of errors. In each retelling, he adjusted the balance between remorse and pride. Sometimes hints of guilt slipped through. He talked about the risks, the danger, the toll of deceiving people who trusted him. Other times, the spark in his eyes revealed something else: the satisfaction of having beaten huge systems with nothing but intelligence and nerve. On that media stage, Ferdinand Demara walked a very thin line. He was both defendant and narrator, accused and storyteller of his own life. Fame gave him something none of his earlier identities ever had: the chance to embrace the role of the great imposter as a public mask, without forged documents, without borrowed uniforms. And yet, behind the spotlight, one question remained unanswered. After so many roles, was there still a solid someone underneath all those layers? Or had the legend already swallowed the man whole? By the 1960s, Ferdinand Demara's body no longer slipped so easily into borrowed uniforms. The face that once passed unnoticed had become a little too familiar. Magazine stories, a book, TV appearances. The great imposter was no longer just a ghost drifting through the back rooms of institutions. He was a recognizable figure in popular culture, and for someone who lived by hiding in plain sight, visibility was a problem. The big scams became impractical. There was no more room to show up as a war surgeon, dean, or psychologist without the immediate risk of being recognized. His large frame, advancing age, and his own fame all narrowed the range of characters he could plausibly play. But instead of disappearing completely, Demara started taking on smaller roles, still orbiting the identity that had made him famous. In 1960, he appeared in a place no one would have predicted: the movies. He had a bit part in the horror film The Hypnotic Eye, making a brief appearance as a surgeon. The irony was almost cruel. On screen, he played the very thing that, in another context, had been his greatest imposture and his most improbable episode. Under cameras, lights, and scripted lines, the doctor was now just a fictional extra, controlled by a director, safely framed as make-believe. It was as if the world had decided to absorb his story by turning it into pure entertainment. Outside the studio, though, life was far less glamorous. Away from the spotlight, Demara started taking low-profile jobs. In Los Angeles, he worked as a counselor at a shelter for people experiencing homelessness. There, the man who had spent years occupying positions that weren't really his lived alongside people who had never had a chance to occupy any position at all. He heard stories of failure, addiction, abandonment, lives shattered without any heroic gloss. That raw contact with the margins of society changed something in the way he moved through the world. The man who had mastered the art of playing roles began to be sought out by people who had no character to perform, only their pain. Listening, which had once been a tool for manipulation, started to become a tool for care. This back and forth between imposture and real compassion quietly prepared the ground for the turning point that was coming. In 1967, Ferdinand did something that, in the context of his biography, was almost a radical act. He earned a legitimate qualification. Instead of stealing documents or faking resumes, he graduated from a Bible college in Oregon. He studied, did the coursework, sat through classes, handed in assignments. For the first time, the certificate he received actually matched the path he had walked. With this real diploma in hand, he found a new door, and this time he didn't have to break it down. He got a job as a chaplain at a hospital in Anaheim, in Orange County, California. Once again, the setting changed. White corridors, rooms with monitors beeping, the smell of antiseptic, anxious family members trying to sleep in uncomfortable chairs. Moving through all this, a large man with a calm voice carried something you can't measure in lab tests: presence. As a chaplain, Demara discovered a role that didn't require shiny degrees or academic prestige, but a mix of humanity and steadiness. He walked into rooms where diagnoses were devastating, sat beside patients who knew they weren't going to leave, held trembling hands, prayed when asked, talked when silence got too heavy. Many of the people he met had no idea who he had once been. To them, he wasn't the great imposter. He was just the chaplain who showed up when the pain hit hardest. Inside the hospital, news of his old life leaked out slowly, in fragments. A doctor recognized the name. Someone else remembered the book. Another brought up the movie with Tony Curtis based on his story. Little by little, his cloudy past spread through the back halls. By the 1970s, that accumulated memory reached the administration. The questions started up again. Was it acceptable to keep as chaplain a man who had built a life out of fraud? A man who had posed as a doctor, professor, and religious figure without truly being any of them? The possibility of firing him was seriously discussed. In a medical setting, credibility is a core asset. Having a famous ex-imposter on staff raised ethical, legal, and institutional dilemmas. For some, it was a matter of principle. It didn't matter how he behaved now. His past alone should be enough to show him the door. That's when one person became crucial: Philip Cifarelli, head of the medical staff. Unlike those who only knew Demara from headlines or a book, Cifarelli saw him every day at the hospital. He watched the chaplain accompany terminal patients, comfort families in shock, show up at the exact moments when medicine's technical work hits the wall of human limits. To him, this new Demara was not the old con artist, but a dedicated worker, loved by patients and respected by the staff. Cifarelli took a stand. He openly advocated for keeping Demara, arguing that here, he wasn't stealing any title or pretending to have a training he didn't possess. The Bible college degree was real. The work he did was real. The people who found some relief in his presence weren't touched by a fake resume, but by who he had become, or at least by how he now chose to act. The administration hesitated, weighed the risks, consulted the owners. In the end, it made a decision that contrasted sharply with the quiet expulsions of his past. The hospital let him stay. More than that, they allowed him to live on the hospital grounds. Thanks to the trust he had built with Cifarelli and one of the owners, Demara literally began living inside the place where he worked, as if, finally, he had found an institution he didn't have to deceive in order to call it home. In this chapter of his life, there were no big scams, no scandalous headlines, no improvised surgeries guided by a hidden manual. What there was routine. Daily visits to patients, low-voiced conversations, simple prayers, hard goodbyes. The great imposter settled into a role that, of all the masks he'd worn, might have been the closest thing to a late-found calling. A man offering spiritual comfort without pretending to be someone else. For the first time, Ferdinand Waldo Demara held an institutional job with no forged documents, no invented resume, no borrowed persona. And quietly, the hospital chaplain became the most enduring version of himself. Not because it was the most spectacular, but because, unlike all the others, it didn't need to be held up by a single lie. The hospital room is small, lit by a harsh white light that forgives no detail. Tubes, monitors, that stubborn smell of disinfectant. On the bed, a large man, now shrunken by illness and time, stares at the ceiling as if searching, in invisible cracks, for some clue about his own life. His legs are gone. Diabetes took them, one after the other. The chaplain who once walked these corridors offering spiritual comfort is now just another patient, trapped inside his own weakness. In his final years, Ferdinand Waldo Demara's body finally presented the bill his biography seemed to have delayed. Severe diabetes moved forward without mercy, destroying blood vessels, eating away at his extremities, slowly compressing the edges of his autonomy. With every surgery, a piece of his mobility disappeared. With every complication, the distance between him and the world shrank. The big, bustling figure, once full of movement and improvisation, had become almost immobile. Between 1980 and 1982, the transition was complete, from active chaplain to full-time patient. In the hallways, many people still called him by name. Some remembered the comfort he'd given them, the prayers at the bedside, the conversations in which he seemed to understand with surprising clarity, the fear of someone facing the end. Others found out through nurses' whispers or old clippings that this man without legs and with a tired voice had once been the man of 1,000 identities, the great imposter. For those who knew him only as a chaplain, the revelation was jarring. It wasn't just a shady past, it was an entire life built on borrowed roles. Monk, psychologist, professor, surgeon, prison administrator, dean, college founder, medical officer in wartime. The list sounds like fiction, yet there it was, frozen in books, movies, articles, references. There was no way to rewrite it. When asked about his motivations, Demara often answered with a disarming formula: rascality, pure rascality. The line, half joke, half confession, worked like a shield. Instead of long psychological analyses about insecurity, pride, or trauma, he preferred to boil everything down to a kind of calling for mischief. It was a way to drain the moral weight and turn his own life into a running joke. But behind the humor, there was a very clear logic. His philosophy could be summed up in one idea: expanding into the power vacuum. In every institution he passed through, he spotted empty spaces, roles with no owner, poorly defined functions. Where there was a lack of someone with a title, he took the title. Where there was no clear leader, he played the leader. If the organization needed a specialist, he became just enough of a specialist to convince everyone. With documents and demeanor, he created positions for himself out of thin air. That ability to occupy institutional voids turned him into a kind of uncomfortable mirror of the 20th century. In an age obsessed with diplomas, hierarchies, and official stamps, he showed in practice how fragile huge systems could be when faced with one individual, armed with nerve, memory, and a good story. Armies, universities, religious orders, prisons, hospitals, all of them, at some point, opened their doors to a man who was not exactly who he claimed to be. Culture wasted no time turning that discomfort into narrative. Robert Crichton's book, The Great Imposter, gave his life a literary frame, massively expanding the reach of his legend. Then came the movie of the same name, starring Tony Curtis, in which Hollywood retold his exploits as a kind of dramedy, softening the gravity and emphasizing the charm of the central figure. Musicians dropped his story into song lyrics. TV writers for shows like MASH drew inspiration from his ability to pose as a military doctor. Fictional characters who can be anyone echo, directly or indirectly, Demara's silhouette. He became an archetype, the charming imposter, the almost likable con man, the guy who outplays institutions with sheer brains. For many, a fascinating anti-hero. For others, a sharp reminder that talent without ethics can produce feats and irreparable damage. Meanwhile, in the far less glamorous reality of Anaheim, his body was falling apart. Chronic pain, physical limits, and total dependence on continuous care kept shrinking his world. Death came on June 7, 1982, from heart failure and complications of diabetes. 60 years old, a hospital as his final backdrop. Far from warships, packed auditoriums, and TV stages, the price of the masks showed up in layers. There was the physical price, a wrecked body, no longer able to carry the mobility that once took him from monasteries to destroyers, from classrooms to wartime infirmaries. There was the emotional price, a trail of ruptures, relationships cut off, institutions abandoned at the exact moment when trust was beginning to solidify. And there was the existential price, the difficulty after so many performances of knowing where the character ended and the person began. Demara had an extraordinary memory, above average intelligence, and enough charisma to hold entire rooms in his hand. He could have followed any number of legitimate paths: teacher, administrator, religious leader, maybe even a doctor if he had chosen to face the long grind of formal training. Instead, he chose the fast lane, the shortcuts. Where others studied for years, he crammed manuals overnight. Where others submitted to exams and evaluations, he showed up with ready-made papers and a confidence that discouraged questions. The fascination his story still provokes lives in that tension. On one side, there's admiration for his nerve, his cool head, his ability to learn under pressure and, in some cases, actually help, as in the improvised surgeries on the HMCS Cayuga, where all the patients survived. On the other side, there's a deep ethical discomfort. How much risk did he impose on people who never knew they were trusting their lives to a character? In the end, Ferdinand Waldo Demara's legacy is less a neat moral lesson and more an open question. With his own life, he showed how easily complex systems can be fooled when they rely too much on appearances and paperwork. He showed that unrestrained intelligence can become weapon as much as virtue. And he left behind a question that lingers long past 1982. After so many uniforms, so many names, so many invented titles, who exactly was the man dying in that hospital room when finally he wasn't pretending to be anyone else? Would you trust someone like Ferdinand Demara? If this story made you think about how far someone can go using nothing but charm and lies, hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next cases. Share this video with someone who loves unbelievable stories and comment down below. Was Demara a dangerous genius, or just another product of the cracks in the system?